Okay, so you should be seeing my slide deck now. Okay, great, perfect, thank you. Okay, so this evening we'll be talking about space for all, the democratization of space. As mentioned, I'm Fernando Gutierrez. You can find me at Latino Futurist all over the place. So what I mean by the democratization of space, I'm not going to say that much more tonight. It's kind of hard to say at this point in the evening, is primarily the changes that have occurred from the old days to where we are now and where we're headed. So so a little bit of history. At the dawn of the space age, the players were primarily government agencies, primarily NASA, the Soviet space program, the European Space Agency, Canadian Space Agency, and the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency. These were the old guard, and these were the agencies that primarily put things into space. The history of that you can see here. These agencies, they brought some of the greatest hits of the last 65 years, including Sputnik, Gagarin and Tereshkova, who were the first man and woman respectively in space, through Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo for the US, to the exploration of the solar system with various rovers and probes, to the triumphs and tragedies of the space shuttle program, to the ISS, which launched in 1998. Interesting fact that there are students now graduating college who have never lived in a world without a human being in orbit above their heads. Interesting to ponder that there has been someone in space since the late 90s, early 2000s. And so that's the first time in human history that we have had an unbroken human presence in space. So that's pretty much where things were up until the last decade or so. So enough of the history lesson. Let's talk about the current state of things. So before I mentioned the old guard, and so the new guard, as the song goes, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So there's a bit of that. You know, we have a lot of the same heavy hitters: NASA, European Space Agency, JAXA, Canadian Space Agency. The Soviet Space Agency has swapped for Roscosmos. But still a lot of the same players there, and we add China to the mix with the Chinese National Space Agency as well, having made some significant headway in space, even though we don't hear about it that much on the news. The fact that they've got rovers on the moon and on Mars, and they have a space station that is occupied in low Earth orbit. So that's what I would call the new old guard. Those are the more classic space agencies that are still launching and putting people and putting objects and technology into orbit. Along with that new old guard, there are the new players. There are a bunch of new kids on the block. SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, and Blue Origin. I'm sure you guys are familiar with those. They're focused on putting people and cargo into low Earth orbit, with obviously SpaceX with their Starship looking for greater things to come. And Blue Origin also, they've been launching New Shepard. They're hoping to launch New Glenn, which will be able to go beyond just ballistic orbit and into Earth orbit. As well as Virgin Galactic, we've seen Richard Branson in space, a little bit more on the space tourism side. And then you've got companies like Rocket Lab and Virgin Orbit and Astra, and they're primarily setting their sights on launching small satellites, with Rocket Lab actively working to join SpaceX at the forefront of the reusability challenge, being able to pluck their satellites out of the sky and reuse them, or their rockets rather. Meanwhile, we've got companies like Maxar, Satellogic, which is based in my native country of Uruguay. Little plug there. Planet in Capella Space, and they're creating constellations of Earth observation satellites, which is really helping to bring down the cost of imaging for both private and public use, bringing that down significantly through the use of small satellites. So what does that mean? It brings us to a new reality. These companies are ushering in a new era of miniaturization. reusability, and space tourism and imaging. As you can see here by some of these examples, we've got, William Shatner recently went up on the Blue Origin capsule on the New Shepard, and then, as I mentioned, Richard Branson up on the top left there. You can see Rocket Lab catching one of their boosters with a helicopter. So they're looking to catch them before they hit the salt water so that they can quickly reuse them, similar to what SpaceX is doing. So really the only other company that's anywhere close to SpaceX in terms of reusability there. Top center, you've got Satellogic, and with an example of one of their small satellites. Those satellites, they expect them to be in orbit for just a few years, but they're so small and inexpensive that they'll just keep launching new ones as they come down. And really the greatest impact until recently of these efforts has been the decline in cost. But the image on the top right kind of lets us know that we're ushering in another period as well, because we've got private satellite imaging companies like Satellogic and Maxar who have been providing high resolution images to the Ukrainian government to assist in their efforts against Russian invasion, something that would have been impossible just a few decades back. And that image is actually from Maxar, and it is a Russian tank and truck convoy. And if you look on YouTube or if you watch the news, you'll see these companies being interviewed at times, and they're very careful about what images they share. They're very careful when they are on these broadcasts and not be sharing images that could be used against the Ukrainian forces. So it's really interesting to see how these private efforts are really changing everything from how we look at space to how we look at even warfare. Pretty neat stuff. Next, just wanted to quickly glance here at space agencies by region. It's easy to forget that there are agencies besides NASA and the European Space Agency and China and Roscosmos, but there is a flurry of space activity on every major continent. And looking at the list here, I won't bore you by reading them, but we've got anywhere from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars being spent annually by different space agencies on different continents, doing everything from launching small satellites that might just be used for weather, agriculture, to, obviously, in the case of China and Roscosmos and NASA and European Space Agency, actually putting humans and their cargo into space. So a lot of money being spent in space. And just real quick here, here's a graphic representation of the expenditure by nation, rather than by continent. And as you can tell, there's no surprise that USA's got the biggest bubble there at 38 billion for 2020. So you can see that despite that, and the other countries being smaller, that there are countries pretty much all over the world at this point that are spending often significant sums, and certainly based on their GDP, on space exploration and other space ventures.
Can I ask a quick question on all
this?
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
If I use the airport as my metaphor,
yeah,
we don't let all these private air companies fly around without having some air traffic control going, look,
sure,
you guys are too close to each other, you're going to crash, you're flying over kind of subdivisions that is a no-fly zone. What is there a global mediating power that at least makes sense of all of this and make sure that we're not launching satellites on the same trajectory and all of that? Like, how does that all go down?
That is interesting. There are global treaties, and the nations generally talk to each other. The U.S. Air Force, I believe it's the Strategic Air Command, does maintain active observation of space, looking for debris, looking for objects. They're the ones that generally will warn the space station when things get near them. Lots of space agencies coordinate with each other during launches to make sure that they are launching into orbits that won't endanger other craft or or astronauts or cosmonauts or taikonauts. That being said, there's no, just like there's no international FAA, that's the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. There's no international one overarching agency that says you can fly here, you can't fly here. It's all based on treaty and it's all based on agreements. Space is kind of that way as well. Obviously, you've got situations where that are suboptimal. We have a lot of junk in space right now. And there are companies that are actively working on technology to start removing that junk. So part of these launches are going to be not to add more things into space, but to actually be able to launch vehicles that can go up and one way or another remove space junk. So as this grows and expands eventually, I think there's going to have to be a much more active system to handle that type of situation. But as of right now, it's fairly passive, and again, it's based on treaties and mutual agreements. What doesn't help is when you have events like when Russia tested essentially a satellite killer last year, where they blew up one of their own satellites, and so they caused all kinds of debris, and it happened to be in an orbit that was very near to crossing the orbit of the International Space Station. So there was a time after that that test occurred where the astronauts that were on the space station, including some Russian astronauts, had to get into the capsules that are always docked there. They're what they use to go up and down, and they're also used as lifeboats. And so basically had to get in their lifeboats and get ready in case any of that debris hit the space station and made it uninhabitable. So yeah, it's definitely a concern, but at this point there's nobody that you can call for clearance to launch your satellite from Kenya. It's going to be the government of Kenya that you have to talk to, and then they talk to whoever they need to talk to make sure that it's okay for you to launch.
Thanks for that, Fernando.
Yeah,
scary, but thank you.
Yeah, it is. It is very much, in a way, it's kind of the Wild West still, just because up until very recently, there wasn't much in terms of private launches. So it was real easy when you have a handful of agencies for them to talk to each other, especially when they're working on projects like the International Space Station, where most of the people that can launch are working on the same project. So it's easy to be able to kind of talk to each other and agree on what you want to do. Obviously, that relationship has become a bit strained in the last few months, but we're still working together. American astronaut came down on a Soyuz capsule, and the Russian authorities treated him well and sent him home. So we are still working well together in space, even with the strain of the war going on. So hopefully that will continue. All right, great question.
When I look at these numbers, back to the numbers, I'm
Sure.
thinking, a trade and support for war, and a specific example in Ukraine, the Americans supporting that tragedy with a $40 billion payment, 40 billion.
Right.
I'm not seeing 40 billion there. I'm seeing Elon Musk try and buy Twitter for 40, or maybe $25 billion. And is the space program this small?
Now, remember, keep in mind, these are annual expenditures. So, this is what it costs basically for research and development, and to keep the lights on, and to keep folks at in Houston and talking to the space station and all those good things.
Well, I'll give you another one because I know this one. It's $15 billion is the Canadian military budget annual, and I see $249 million.
Right. That would be for the Canadian Space Agency
Yeah,
specifically.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just
So,
sort of comparatively, we don't spend a lot on this thing, and I guess is it changed a lot across the last 10 years?
I don't know that it's significantly changed. I mean, obviously, budgets grow. Um, Looking at the numbers, when reading this report, it's about 50, 60 pages out of Space in Africa, and it ends in 2020. But because of COVID, it does end at the end of 2020, so it does have 2020 numbers, and there were significant shrinkage in expenditures for 2020 just because of the unsure nature of what was
Right.
going to happen with COVID, and obviously, revenues and things like that.
Mhm.
So it does fluctuate. I mean, over time, it definitely does grow. I think what's interesting though
Mhm.
is the way the costs change as privatization increases. When you look at SpaceX and their reusability and what they've done to the cost
Mhm.
of launching humans into space, and you compare that with the fact that NASA's still working on their space launch system, which they rolled it out for a wet rehearsal, where they basically load the fuel tanks, and they couldn't load everything because they had problems with the valves and they had to roll it back in.
Mhm.
And they're talking about $2 to $4 billion per launch for essentially a non-reusable
Mhm.
system.
Mhm.
Whereas SpaceX has their Falcon Heavy that can do a similar job. They're looking at Starship that will be able to do a similar job and more. And the thought is that those will be able to do those things at a fraction of the cost. So in reality, I live in Florida. The day that Space Launch System launches, I plan to be there to watch it.
Mhm.
But I can't imagine at those costs that we're ever going to launch more than one or two of them before we say, you know what, private can do it cheaper. Let's do it cheaper. So even if those numbers don't increase, I think as time goes on, we do continue to get more bang for our buck with all these private initiatives. So I think definitely we're gonna continue to see the benefit of that, even if those expenditures don't go up
Mhm.
significantly. So yeah, good question. Thank you. All right, moving along. So next, I just wanted to use Latin America as an example to talk about the current influences that are acting on space goals. And this one is Latin America because you've got things like foreign aid in here, and you can see investment is at the center of the map, and demand is influenced by various factors. On the bottom left, for example, critical needs. So, in Latin America, for example, you might have weather, communications, agriculture, security. Those are things that are very important. They're important to everybody, but if you have Latin America is creating more and more intergovernmental agencies, so they're being able to do things like share the cost of security, which they were not able to do before. So miniaturization is another one that I discussed before, and I'll be talking about it a little bit more going forward. That plays an important part as a disruptor, because all of a sudden, you've got CubeSats, you've got much smaller satellites that can do the job of something that used to be the size of a Volkswagen or a minivan. And you've got the same concerns up at the top around aid, for example, that were talked about years ago. Even in the US, when we had folks walking on the moon, people were saying, we've got all these problems at home. We had Vietnam protests, we had all these issues going on. We had the war on poverty, and the thought was, can't this money be better spent on Earth? So, that's can be an influential factor. And then on the bottom right, for example, you've got universities that will also is another huge factor. You need educated folks to be able to run these programs. And so the investment kind of goes back and forth. You might have some private equity investing in universities, and that kind of helps generate the next generation of professionals that will be working in your space program. So you do wind up developing possibly some symbiotic relationships there. So that's pretty much the current state of things in Latin America in terms of the influences on the space sector. So next, I'd like to talk about possible futures. I mean, we know what the current state of the world is, and specifically, like I said, I'll be focusing on Latin America for a little bit. So what might the future look like? So I want to talk about the specific domain of space exploration in the emerging and developing world. The critical thing is, one of the big critical things is infrastructure. We need space-related infrastructure. We need telecommunications. We need power. We need public transportation. An impact on that might be poverty. Along with that, obviously, we need agencies. We need national, regional agencies. We need alliances. We need private and commercial working together within the domain to help move the industry along. Next, obviously, you can't have space without aerospace, right? So in terms of logistics, in terms of composite materials, training, certifications, all that kind of stuff, like the question that Sean asked earlier, how do we do this? How do we agree to do these things? Some of that is infrastructure, and some of that is logistics. It's figuring out how to get the materials there, how to get the people there, how to get the education there. Within the industries, you've got things like incentives, raw materials. Do you have the raw materials? Do you have venture capital? Is there demand? Looking at the world today, there's definitely demand for space technology. As I mentioned before, you've got Ukraine, that they don't have satellites of their own necessarily, but they are certainly glad that there are private agencies that can provide them satellite imaging for their needs. In terms of geography, you want some good geography. Depending on the type of orbit that you're going to launch, for example, you might want to be closer to the equator. You might want to be closer to the poles. You want to have good weather. You want to be in a place where you're not going to be killing endangered species every time you launch. You want to be in places where maybe if your customers that are going to be, maybe you're launching from Africa, but your customers are primarily going to be in Europe. So you want to try to make sure that you're on similar time zones, things like that. So that comes into play. And then just in general, under Steve, there's lots of other factors, the versus miniaturization, common language, and poverty that could have positive or negative influences on the future of the space exploration domain. Obviously for Latin America, for the most part, common language. I a lot of folks in Brazil who speak Spanish, a lot of folks around Brazil that speak Portuguese, and most folks for the most part speak English. So that definitely helps. The amount of regulatory constraint can have an influence on those types of things as well. So this is pretty much the domain that we're looking at. This is the types of things that could influence the future of space exploration in these regions. So these major facets within space exploration domain are going to be the driving factors that answer the open questions surrounding the expansion of space exploration among emerging and developing nations. So, you've got questions, you got things around finance and investment, what agencies there are, the infrastructure development, as I mentioned, environment, the miniaturization, and then privatization. All these things are going to be factors. And the questions that will arise is, are investors going to be willing to take a risk on these areas? Depending on these factors, are governments going to do what they need in terms of long-term growth potential, in terms of infrastructure investment to support these initiatives? Is privatization going to be the way to go, or is it going to be more of a public-private partnership like we're seeing now with SpaceX and NASA, for example, and even companies like Rocket Lab, which is only launching small rockets. They are, and Astra as well is only launching small rockets, but they do have contracts with other governments and with NASA to launch some of their vehicles. A, because they're proven that their technology works, and B, because NASA wants to make sure that they are supporting as many viable alternatives as possible. And then the other question is, can the developing emerging nations be stable and create alliances with other regional or international partners? You know, can they play nice together? You know, that's not always the case in developing and emerging areas of the world. So that's going to be a critical factor to success going forward as we continue to try to democratize space and move it beyond the traditional players, as mentioned before. I want to take just one factor, miniaturization, as I mentioned it before, as an example, and just wanted to kind of walk you through how it can drive growth in a sector, in this case, the local small satellite market. So miniaturization has reduced the barrier to entry into the commercial space market, and it's created an increased opportunity for new players to enter the industry. And so what happens there is, with the miniaturization, obviously with the benefit of that, you've got a smaller, that drives a smaller satellite size. And when you have a smaller satellite, it's less weight. Well, it's less components, so it's cheaper, but it's also less weight to put into orbit, because, as we well know, every pound, every kilo that you put into orbit costs thousands and thousands of dollars. So the smaller your satellite, the cheaper it is to launch it. You know, and that lower cost creates a greater opportunity, because you can now create more satellites and launch more satellites. And the more you build, obviously, as they say, if you build it, they will come. So you know, that opportunity helps drive the small satellite market. So, you know, when you see the success of, you know, Maxar and Satellogic and you know, Planet and some of the other companies that are sharing their imaging in places like Ukraine and selling their imaging for much less than has ever been available to these developing areas, and they actually are working on sliding scales for their costs. So, you know, if you're in a more impoverished region, your imaging will cost less. They are actively seeking to do that, because their drive as well is to democratize this access to the space and to space imaging. So kind of neat to see how that circle sort of reinforces itself, you know. And obviously, the more small satellites you build, the more small components you need, and so that drives miniaturization as well, because the folks that are building that stuff for you say, well, you know, maybe if we can make it smaller, we can sell more of them. So the wheel just kind of goes round and round. So what's next? What could emerge, and what could be the potential disruptors? You know, what could, you know, what could throw a wrench into all of this? Looking back at the influence map that I had shown earlier for Latin American example, I took as an example the issues that have stymied efforts in the past to build infrastructure and improve day-to-day life for Latin Americans as one example of what could impact the space industry. So, you know, let's say you've got a situation like Venezuela, where it was a democratic nation and then it wasn't, and, you know, there was nationalization of industry and things like that. So, you know, you've got things like that. You've got graft, lack of infrastructure, alienation of investors due to government confiscation, that could, you know, include plus corruption that could make local space initiatives fail. And so you could see here, you know, things like, you know, on the top right, corruption could dry up aid from foreign nations, and without foreign aid, maybe, you know, you you can't afford to feed people, let alone put satellites into space, or continue space programs. On the bottom right, private investment dries up for things like startups and international cooperation projects due to confiscations of the means of production. I'm not going to invest in your country if you're going to wind up taking what I build and keeping it for yourself or for the government or for whoever happens to be in charge this year. On the bottom left, nationalistic projects. A lot of times in the past, you've had projects that were just, make work or used to line the pockets of whoever happened to be in charge, and they never really go anywhere, and they don't meet realistic demands. And so that kind of winds up causing any efforts to dry up. And then finally on the left, top left, if you've got a manufacturing relationship with foreign countries, in this case, for example, I've got Europe as an example, because right now Satellogic is building facilities in Scandinavian countries to build satellites there. So those relationships could fail due to things like tariffs or confiscations or maybe even human rights issues. If you've got a human rights abuses going on in your country, it's entirely probable that European nations, their companies will want to work for you, and the nations may not even let them work with you. So those are all factors that could be disruptive. So having gone through those, want to posit a few possible scenarios. Obviously, as we know, having lived through the interesting years that we've lived through, we had a pandemic, we had a breach of the U.S. Capitol, and we've had lots of other black swan events all happen at once that we wouldn't expect. Obviously we can't control for everything, but these are a few possible scenarios that could happen. So in one case, the first case that I just mentioned, disruptive change leads to chaos because of politically motivated public projects. So this is the classic Latin American model, where you've got your grand jingoistic projects that they're infrastructure programs that bring personal glory to the leaders, think North Korea maybe, while creating little value lining the pockets of politicians or contractors or families, and progress doesn't really go anywhere. And these things, the key drivers for these are public infrastructure projects that go over budget and are poorly executed due to lax or corrupt oversight, and they're insufficient to achieve any real lasting improvements. These are just, hey, look at me kind of projects. Private investment is curtailed by concerns over viability and corruption, and there's limited interest in collaboration with other public or private programs. Everybody kind of wants their own piece of the pie, and they want to keep it to themselves. So that is one scenario that these are the types of things that we've seen happen in the past in emerging developing nations, and could certainly happen again. And it wouldn't derail necessarily these projects overall. We'd still see growth in other regions, but on a regional level, we could definitely see some failure or collapse because of this. In the next scenario, we could see more of a public investment in space exploration. We could see that, right now, for example, China and Russia are investing a lot of money, and maybe Russia not as much as they had been, but they have been investing a lot of money in Latin America for scientific projects, everything from satellite tracking stations to observatories, to helping them with some of their launch capabilities, to launching satellites for them. So, you could see possibly government saying, you know what, enough of this. We don't want any more foreign influence. We're tired of foreign influence. We're trying to decolonize. We're trying to do our own thing, and we will, thank you very much, handle our own projects here. So, they could decide that after centuries of foreign influence and manipulation, their best course is to go it alone. They could invest in popular and populist initiatives, kind of like NASA's moonshot, that would bring pride to their nations and people, and make sure that they've got achievable and sustainable goals that would move them from a historic role as a colony to those of colonizers of Mars and the the asteroid belt and the other planets, let's say. So some of the key drivers for this would be extensive public investment in infrastructure improvements, specifically related to space ventures. So you're looking at things like internet, satellite communications, maybe roads, maybe ports, maybe railroads, depending on what you're looking at. I know that Brazil is building several space-related cities, specifically to support space initiatives, for example. You'd want an aggressive restructuring of education to support space initiatives. So education around engineering, mathematics, STEM, STEAM as well, because you do definitely want some good designers. And then because these are smaller nations, obviously looking at the bubbles from the earlier map, we don't have a $44 billion bubble anywhere but in the US. So you'd want regional alliances rather, that allow for more ambitious program goals. So rather than maybe one nation going it alone, you've got groups like ALCE, which includes Mexico and Argentina and several other Latin American countries, for example. There's Pan-African space agencies that are working together as well. So those are situations where you could be lean and mean and get a lot done. And then the final scenario as a potential for disruption would be, and I personally think this is your best case scenario, you've got private investment in space and public investment in infrastructure. And this is very similar to the NASA SpaceX model that we see occurring right now, where we've got government space programs that they understand that space exploration is critical to long-term social and economic well-being of their countries, but they don't have the budgets, the resources necessarily. So they turn to private investment as well. And so the government does their part by upgrading electrical grids, broadband, roads, and ports, and creating things like new space cities, as I mentioned earlier, as well as regions that they tailor to support space initiatives. And they use these upgrades to their infrastructure and to their education system and what have you to entice and incentivize private space ventures. So, we're open for business. Come on down, or come on over, depending on where we're talking about. But, the key drivers for this would be public investment in core infrastructure improvements, access to STEM education at all age and economic levels, stable broadband connectivity for the majority of folks. As we saw during the pandemic here, one of the biggest issues with students staying home in the US at least, and certainly in Florida, was students in rural areas don't necessarily have the same internet connectivity as kids in the city. So that's something that becomes critical if you want to grow. So also you'd want to see incentives for private development of space initiatives and related support activities. So whatever it takes to entice these private agencies to come in and build there and employ your folks, you'd want to do that. And then look for public-private alliances that allow for more ambitious program goals. If it wasn't for SpaceX's Dragon capsule right now, the US wouldn't have any way to get to the space station, because once we retired the shuttles, all we had was the Russian space agency Roscosmos and their Soyuz. And obviously with the relationship strained the way it is, our astronaut that was up there had a ticket already and they honored it, but it's not something that we would necessarily expect to happen going forward. So that public-private alliance is something that we've already seen that works. And now Boeing Starliner just docked and undocked from the International Space Station as well. So we may have a new player there as well to ferry folks up. So those types of alliances would definitely be beneficial in terms of helping grow the scenario in the emerging and developing world. And And that's pretty much all I wanted to share today. So I can open it up for question and answer if anyone has any questions that I could try to answer, or anybody has any answers that they'd like
I
to
have
share.
so many questions for you after this. Just it's good. It's the power of a good presentation. It leads you with more questions going, where do we take this? But Fernando, let's postulate something here. So
Sure.
maybe we'll take the president of El Salvador. I know he's one of Agustin's favorite because he's young. Mm-hmm. He appreciates technology. He's invested in some blockchain, Bitcoin, but and yeah, by most standards, he probably has a lot of political clout in his own country to do some things that maybe some others can't. If I'm in his shoes and I go through your presentation going, there's a window here, like there's a window for me to do something interesting in space. And I wrote down like 10 or 11 things that could be playing on his mind, between, you know, the sense of national pride and a showpiece for their stuff, to building an innovation culture in your country, to getting inside access to some of the bigger countries' technology because you're part of their ecosystem, to you know, making a buck, to having this stuff translate to other industries in your country because you've kept the leading talent in your country. There's so many different things. What should I be thinking? Maybe it's a two-parter. What is he thinking about typically, and what should he be thinking about?
Well, what is he thinking about? I mean, I think the most important thing is the moment is now. You know, it's still the Wild West. And traditionally what happens is the big players get out ahead and they kind of do whatever they want. And then by the time the small players show up, that's when people start saying, oh, we need to start regulating this. And no, we need to start putting constraints on this. We can't just let anybody, you know, go into, when it was just us and the Russians, you know, who's going to stop us, you know? But now that you've got, you know, if you look at the list on one of my prior slides, you've got dozens of space agencies conceivably launching, you know, hundreds of times a year. Then somebody says, oh, well, we need to regulate this. We need to control it. Well, you know, that hasn't happened yet. So it's still being the Wild West. It's the best time, you know, it's gold rush days. It's time to go out there and grab what you can, you know, while, you know, before the cast is set. So I think that's an important consideration. Looking forward, I think, as I mentioned before, infrastructure is hugely important. You have certain advantages right now. For example, like Virgin Orbit. I'll give you an example. I don't know. Everybody's familiar with Virgin Galactic because we've all seen Richard Branson floating in space. But they have a quieter company that's called Virgin Orbit, and they launch small rockets from under the wing of a modified 747. And they just bought a couple more planes. So they're going to have several of them by the end of not sure if it's the end of this year, but I think by the end of next year. So what's neat about that launch capability is now all of a sudden you don't need a launch tower. You don't need a local command center. You just need a runway and a payload. So I think you're seeing opportunities like that with the smaller rockets like Astra and Rocket Lab. You could conceivably encourage them to come and launch from your region. I mean, it's great to go for the long pass, but by the same token, if you can get a foothold right now, it's a great time to get a foothold, because once you have even if it's just the infrastructure for small rocket launch, then you've got the opportunity for bigger things. Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral started as just a missile launch center, you know, before we ever really even had a space program, and it was for intercontinental missiles, you know, for the nuclear missiles. And then because that was there, that became America's spaceport. So if you can do something that's the equivalent of Central America spaceport or Latin America spaceport or what have you, you're going to have a leg up, because once you start working with whether it's a private company or a regional agency or what have you, you start figuring out what you need in terms of infrastructure, what you need in terms of education, what you need in terms of professionals, and you start growing these things and you start enticing these things and focusing efforts on that. I think that makes a huge difference. And then once you start seeing results, once you start sharing, maybe you launch some weather satellites and now you're sharing agricultural data with your farmers and you start seeing better crop yields, things like that you get a lot of public goodwill that way. So I think all those are important considerations. I've got right here, I've been holding it, waiting for an opportunity to share it. I've got Andy Weir's Artemis, which is it's a fun read, but essentially it's about a colony on the moon. It's fiction. It's kind of a mystery story, but it takes place on the moon. But the neat thing about it is that the main launch facility for launching to the moon is in Africa, and it's an African nation that just decided that they were going to be a space hub. And so they did it. They did everything they had to do, and they became a major space hub. Which, when you look at the maps of where traditionally the space agencies, like if you look at a map of all the space agencies involved in the International Space Station, it's all Northern Hemisphere. With a little bit of Australia, but primarily it's Japan a little bit, Europe quite a bit, obviously Russia and the US being the bulk of it, Canada, obviously having an important role in there as well. But south of the equator, the lights are pretty dark. But what Latin America, Oceania, and Africa have that North America and Europe do not have is they have the equator, because equatorial launches are the cheapest launches because you're already moving 1,000 miles an hour. So there are definitely some geographic benefits to launching from these southern continents that haven't really been taken to great use yet. Although European Space Agency, they launched from French Guiana, so they've taken that advantage for quite a while. I think I answered your question somewhere in there.
Questions, but I'm gonna let somebody else ask other questions, because I have so many. Like I just and part of my previous question was, I live in Canada, so my daily reality is, yeah, we could do something, but we have this big elephant to the south of us that are 10 to 11 times our size. So Canada doesn't tend to do the right thing in these scenarios that often, but I think taking a leading approach with the Canadarm, which is on the space shuttle, and doing things along those lines makes a lot of sense. And I thought there might be some parallels to some of the Latin American and African and other countries that might even have less of a budget.
Yeah, no, I think so. And keep in mind that Canada also has built the arms that are used on the space station as well. So you guys are really good at arms. You got to give it to you there.
There's a joke in there somewhere.
Yeah, there is.
For the punchline.
There is. The Canadian called arms. Yeah, one of the scenarios that I looked at in the past for Latin America is things like, and it's very blue collar, and so it's a little it's a little stereotypical, but things like removing space debris. It's not going to be the most glamorous thing. Nobody's ever going to write a great science fiction novel about removing space debris, but it's something that needs to be done, and it's something that can probably be done fairly inexpensively. So that might be a good opportunity for a country where you don't necessarily need to have a big space program where you're launching people into orbit. But if you can host some of these private companies that are looking to either remove or collect space debris, there's some good opportunities there. It's one of those things. It's hard to know. You never know what's going to be the disruptor. You never know who's going to be the Uber that's going to, disrupt the taxi industry. And with space, it's kind of the same thing. If you'd said a decade ago that we were regularly going to be watching rockets land, like they do in the old science fiction movies. They don't even do that in new science fiction movies because it's so old school. That's what they did in the old movies because they thought something silly like that would work. And now SpaceX has landed over 100 rockets. They've got some rockets that they've reused about a dozen times. As I mentioned earlier, Rocket Lab, they're smaller rockets. They're going a little bit lower tech. They're actually catching their rockets. I don't know if anybody has seen that, but they're catching their rockets with helicopters. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty neat concept. So yeah.
Can you give me the 15 seconds on that? How does the thing slow up enough to be able to then catch it with a helicopter? And I'm guessing weight's involved here too. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They are much smaller rockets. And so what they do is, I'll just go back through real quick here because sorry about that. I do have a shot of it in here. That went too far, too many. If you look here on the top left, that is actually a helicopter, and this was during a test. What they do is when the first stage comes back to Earth, it deploys a parachute. Kind of like if you remember the old space shuttle solid rocket boosters, when they re-entered the atmosphere, they deploy a parachute and then they'd land back in the ocean, and then they'd take them and they'd clean them up and they'd reuse them. Well, they have been doing that, but the problem is you drop a very expensive piece of electronics in salt water, and if you've ever dropped your camera in salt water, it's done. With rockets, you lose a lot of that. Because you have to drop it in the water. So what they've been doing is they once it re-enters the atmosphere, they deploy the chutes. Now it's dropping at 10, 20 miles an hour, something relatively slow. So then they swoop in with a really big cargo helicopter with a hook under it. Again, thinking out of the box, the kind of thing that would have been, on Flash Gordon in the 30s and 40s. Oh, we'll just catch the rocket with a hook, and you'd think it's the silliest thing, but they're doing it. They've done a bunch of tests, and they actually launched earlier this month. And during reentry, they caught the rocket. After they caught it, they did have to, the helicopter pilot decided to release it. He said that there was something unusual in the what did he say? In the weight dynamics, in the load dynamics. So it's possible that they didn't account for the amount of fuel left, or maybe the fuel was sloshing around, or maybe because they were using different types of test bodies before, or maybe it was windy that day, who knows. He wound up having to drop it, but he did catch it. And if it hadn't been for that anomaly, he would have taken it back to base. So it was kind of like in the early days of SpaceX when they brought the rocket back to the pad and then it fell over, where you think, wow, okay, it crashed, but it crashed on the pad. It got to where it was supposed to be. It just didn't, got 99% of the way there. So that was their first test. So it was pretty successful. I know that was more than 20 seconds, but yeah, so that's how they do that. And you can see there that they basically just hook the parachute. Low tech solution, relatively low tech compared to having a rocket come back to where it took off and land itself.
I'd say, there's 10 other things involved in this. Like, where does it know it's going to come? Like, we won't have time, but just an awesome command on the subject, Fernando. I appreciate it. I'm not too sure if it's Gordon or Rob that's shepherding us in and out of the session. I don't know if they have other questions, but I'm very impressed by this, and I walk away more educated than I was an hour ago.
I don't know, Sean, if Hannah had any questions. She made a couple of comments on the way through. Hannah, do you have any questions or comments to make before we wrap? Maybe not. All right. So thanks very much, Fernando. It's always a pleasure learning from you. I look forward to all the new things you'll bring to us again. And I am comforted by the fact you're watching space for us, all of space.
My pleasure.
And you've got my contact information. If you notice any asteroids in my future, please send me a note.
You
I
will
just want to. I just want to be good with it. That's all.
you will be the second one to know.
All right, that's great. So we're going to stop the video and then start it up again, ever so gently, just like that.